Welcome everyone. A quick note that we're recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land wherever you may be located and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular the Pemalong clan of the Wabikal people of the land on which Callaghan campus resides and where we in the room are located today. Our presenter, Greta Hawes, is an Associate Professor at Macquarie University, a Research Associate at the Centre of Hellenic Studies, and a Commissioning Editor for the Classical Review. She is a scholar of Greek myth and is a leading academic in digital modelling for the classics. Her paper today is titled MANTO, an Ancient Myth in the Digital Age. And we're very excited to have you, so over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Kendall, and everyone for that warm welcome. My talk today is really to introduce you to MANTO. Let me just, there we go. Is to introduce you to MANTO, which is a digital data set of Greek myth that models the story world of Greek myth and its impacts on the historical landscape of the Mediterranean. This is a data set which is built up in a very old-fashioned way from hand-curated data. Each of these pieces of data represent assertions made about myth in ancient sources. This is, like almost anything in digital humanities, a collaborative effort. So the material that you're going to see today was created by me in collaboration with a number of people, and key to this is Scott Smith, who is my co-director on this project, Annika Campbell, a master's student and RA at Macquarie University, and you'll be seeing a lot of her images in here. You'll spot them when you see them because I cannot draw that well. Rosie South, again another RA of mine, who co-authored one of the papers that I'll talk about. Kian Colgan and Cara Palladino, who worked with Scott and I on some GIS work, and Cinzia Zhu, another one of my RAs, who did some of the network modelling that you'll see later in here. So through this talk, I'm going to touch on several aspects of our work, but I begin with one overarching idea, and that is the obvious incongruity of trying to capture ancient stories as digital data. 2 decades ago, Lev Manovich famously commented that narratives and databases are natural enemies. His argument has been challenged in various ways over the intervening years, and certainly our understanding of both stories and of databases has changed in 2 decades, but his basic idea still deserves some consideration. His point is essentially this: narratives are experiential phenomena. They should be worked through in chronological order, right? This is why we say stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And stories take their effect from the interplay of action and then reaction, suspense, release, complication, and resolution. Databases are quite different from this because they're more like descriptions of things. They don't have this same linear tension. They exist all at once, and they don't require any particular kind of sequential ordering or linear trajectory to function. So we can navigate a database however we want, and we kind of look down magisterially on, say, a spreadsheet, and with a few clicks we can reorder it, right, according to our own desires. Stories, in essence, pick out particular details and they offer them up in a taut sequence. Data kind of lays out and describes a broad paradigm. Manovich claims that as a culture we have seemingly shifted from favouring narratives to favouring databases. But I would point out that his argument is actually a lot more complex than that, and in some ways supports something what I'm about to say. But that's kind of the broadest version of it. So over the years, people have rightly commented that what we are doing with MANTO, as in turning Greek myths into data, is depriving these myths of the qualities that make them special, because we cannot capture in a database the ethical and the emotional aspects of these stories. Now, I actually think that this criticism is entirely justified. Many things can simply not be captured as digital data, and the effects of storytelling on various audiences and varied audiences is certainly amongst those. MANTO is not intended to substitute for the experience of myth. Rather, and speaking perhaps too defensively, I would say that MANTO is in fact part of a long tradition of trying to organise Greek myth. And this is a tradition that goes back into antiquity from, say, the late 6th century with the rise of prose writing. So we're part of essentially a tradition of trying to organise mythic information, but also I would say that in choosing to organise myth as digital data rather than, for example, in another encyclopedia format, I think we're actually possibly have the capacity to express and reveal some of the fundamental qualities of the mythic tradition more clearly than we have been able to do previously. And that's essentially this is going to be my first point. So I'll begin with an origin story. MANTO was born out of frustration in 2018 in a small, almost windowless office. I was shuffling notes and stacking large reference volumes on top of each other and rather half-heartedly compiling kind of spreadsheets to try and work out a way of organising what I was doing. What was really troubling me is I simply could not find the kind of information that I wanted in the format that I wanted to look it up in. I was working on a book about Pausanias, who wrote an account of what there was to see on the Greek mainland in the 2nd century CE, and he tells a lot of the myths that explain the significance of these places. Now, as his account trudged from tiny town to tiny town, I'm sure some of you guys have read this, I wanted to try and work out which other mythic traditions we have from different sources about these same places that Pausanias possibly wasn't telling us. But of course, our standard way of organising Greek mythology is actually by the name of characters, right, of gods and heroes. If I wanted to know the information about a location, I needed to know the name of the character to look up. And of course, if I didn't know which characters were connected to that place, I had no way of essentially trying to work out what the other stories about this place were. Half a world away in New Hampshire, Scott was coming up against a different manifestation of the same basic problem. He actually wanted to show his students a map of the homelands of all the Argonauts, and he was utterly perplexed by the fact that no one had seemingly ever made one of these. So we started venting with each other over emails. Why had no one, for example, catalogued all the tombs of heroes that were mentioned by ancient geographers? We have thousands of books about stories found in Homer and Sophocles and Euripides, right, the most canonical sources, but almost no serious studies of ancient geographers as collectors, narrators, and transmitters of the myth. So emails were exchanged, meetings were called, advice was sought, arguments were had, breakthroughs were celebrated, dead ends were struck, there were a few of those, and little by little, what we call MANTO made it into existence. Now, Scott and I had no prior experience in the digital humanities. We have no special skills in that way, but we knew we wanted to create something that could only exist as an online resource because we wanted it to be a network that could be continually refigured, zoomed in, zoomed out of, and constantly added to. And you simply can't do this by publishing another encyclopedia. We needed, in essence, the right medium to convey our message. So, in fact, the easiest way for me to kind of explain this to you is to give you kind of an example of what we thought Greek myth should look like. Okay, so here's the beginning of Annika's graphics. Okay, so I can start then with the basic key narrative of Homer's Iliad, which is easily plotted. In the 9th year of the attack on Troy, Achilles is slighted by Agamemnon. He withdraws from battle, leaving the Greek contingent to face the Trojans without him. When their defeat is imminent, he finally relents and he allows Patroclus to enter the fray dressed in his armour. Hector kills Patroclus, Achilles kills Hector in turn, and Priam crosses the plain to beg in Achilles' tent for the return of his son's battered corpse. Now, this is essentially a linear narrative in Manovich's kind of model. We can see that we can nonetheless chart it as a series of relationships, a kind of network diagram, nonetheless. But Achilles is one of many possible stories about Troy, and it's nested within a massive chain of cause and effect. So immediately before this, you have Helen absconding with Paris from Sparta to to Troy, and Menelaus assembling this contingent of Greeks to go and retrieve her. After the story of Achilles' wrath, you have Paris killing Achilles with a shot from his bow, and then the death of Priam and the fall of the city. And then we can kind of expand out from there. Why did Helen abscond? Well, because Aphrodite promised her to Paris in exchange for his judging her the most beautiful. Why was he called upon to do this? Because the goddesses were contesting a golden apple which was thrown amongst them as they celebrated the wedding of Peleus and Thetis up here at Thessaly. And then we can keep going out from there. Why was Thetis marrying Peleus? Because no Olympian would marry her, because it was prophesied that his son would be greater than his father. What became of this prophecy? Thetis gave birth to Achilles. Why did so many heroes join Menelaus in his cause? Well, because he had originally won Helen in a bride competition at which all had sworn to support the chosen groom. Why did he win? Well, we're told he gave the most gifts. How could Menelaus have been judged better than Achilles in this? Well, Achilles was too young to compete. And we can keep going out from here. So while the Greeks were besieging Troy, Achilles' son Neoptolemus was living on Skyros. He arrives later and he actually kills Priam. Helen and Menelaus' daughter Hermione, presumably back home in Sparta. We don't hear much about her, but she does actually end up married to Neoptolemus, i.e. Achilles' son. On the plain before Troy, where the two armies fight, there were the remains of a wall, Homer tells us, which had been built a generation earlier by Heracles when he rescued Hesione, Priam's sister and Paris' aunt, from a sea monster. And then, because he was cheated from his promised reward, Heracles actually sent Hesione back to Salamis as the wife of his ally, who was called Telamon. Telamon and Hesione have a son called Teucrus, and Teucrus joins the Greeks as the leader of the Salamis contingent. So he actually ends up at Troy killing some of his own cousins, because the sons of Priam are essentially his cousins. Okay, we can keep going from there. Heracles had another indirect impact on the Trojan War. It's his bow, which is supposedly, which he had used to kill the sea monster, which is supposedly crucial to the defeat of Troy. Philoctetes gets this from him when he is dying on Mount Oeta, and he actually uses that to kill Paris at the very end. After the fall of Troy, Philoctetes goes to Grimissa, which is down here in southern Italy, and he leaves this bow in a sanctuary there. And so in later times, people said that they had this bow of Heracles. There are some other Trojans who leave the city with Antenor, and they go and they go and settle in the region of Venetii, which essentially becomes modern Venice. Aeneas, of course, leaves, and he ends up founding Latium again over in Italy. There's a Greek hero, Diomedes, one of my favourites, who heads for South Italy. There he marries the daughter of Daunus, and he founds these three cities. And in fact, at Agrippa, he fortifies the city using stone from the walls of Troy, this was essentially the stones which have been built into the walls by Poseidon and Apollo. Diomedes ends up dying and being buried on the island of Diomedes. Of the other Greeks, on his way home to Sparta, Menelaus dedicates Paris' dagger and his leather cap to Athena on Rhodes at the same sanctuary. Helen dedicates some of her jewellery and also a cup, and Teucrus leaves behind his bow. Speaking of the sanctuary on Rhodes, the Rhodian contingent is led by another son of Heracles called Ptolemy. He was killed by Sarpedon. Sarpedon also kills one of Achilles' horses, if anyone's keeping score. There was also a tradition that Tlepolemus' widow Polyxo befriends Helen later in Helen's life and actually kills her on Rhodes as a kind of revenge for her husband. There's another tradition that Helen and Achilles end up enjoying a post-mortem existence on the Isles of the Blessed as husband and wife. Now, there won't be a test on this later. My basic point here is that myths are certainly stories. I don't doubt that. but they are also information, right? They are also information about how the world is connected together, conceptually and also physically. So conceptually through things like genealogies, but physically through the remains of physical objects which were left scattered all across the Aegean or the Mediterranean. And so the idea being that there were cities in Italy that could claim to have rocks that had come originally from Troy, and those rocks had originally been moved by the Olympian gods, essentially, into those fortifications. And so this kind of information, these kinds of connections, which go beyond simply stories, are actually easily expressible as data. This is what essentially we are trying to capture. So the basic idea, and this is why I've had it all drawn up in this way, is that Greek myth was information that can be represented as networks of people, places, and objects. And these people, places, and objects are constantly intersecting one another. We could describe this huge network from any number of different perspectives. So whereas the list is the natural format of books, as I've shown you previously, and this is essentially because one word needs to follow another in a linear way. The network, by contrast, is the natural format of digital space. We can zoom in or zoom out for detail or for vast scope. We can trace generations of families, for example, or we can focus on particular places or particular objects. So I could have done this same exercise by starting from, say, Pegasus, who is the horse of Achilles, or by starting with the story of Helen, right? I can get any one of these reference points and do a sort of a similar exercise. The other reason that I've done it like this is because I want to give the sense that Greek myth is not the same as Greek poetry, and it's not the same as one particular poem. Greek myth is essentially a shared conceptual story world, right? It's shared amongst anyone who considers themselves in antiquity to be part of this Greek endeavour. Ancient storytellers assumed that their audiences understood the broader context into which they slotted the particular story that they were telling, right? And this is really obvious, say, in tragedies, where you've got this very small part of this mythic world, and we are seeing just one tiny part of it in action. And equally, because this story world exists, any new traditions could always be essentially added into it, and they would be understood on some level to also be traditional because they were slotted into this world. So what we need essentially to organise this is a kind of non-hierarchical way of working with it, so that we don't, for example, privilege, say, Homer and the tragedians, but we actually allow ourselves to also recognise that, say, ancient geographers and mythographers and historians also had a lot to say about this tradition, but also, quite beyond that, inscriptions can tell us a lot about the local aspects of Greek myth, images on ancient artefacts, for example, and papyri. So this is another reason why this kind of open network idea, which is non-hierarchical, is really useful. Finally, if we're thinking about each of these connections as a kind of a fact or a factoid, right, something that looks like a fact, we also have to recognise that assertions made by ancient sources aren't all going to kind of merge nicely into each other, right? There's going to be disbelief of some traditions by some people. There is going to be ambiguity about what exactly is happening, and there is going to be conflict between these traditions. And so we need to essentially be somewhat naive as we capture this and just capture what is said in the ancient sources and not try to, for example, sort it out and decide which is the best tradition. Again, this non-hierarchical approach. Okay, so as I said, over time, MANTO came into existence. It's been going for, it's a project that's been going for about 6 years now, and it's getting more and more sizable. So I wanted just to take you through a little bit of this, just to show you what this all looks like. This is essentially the landing page on our public interface. The idea being, and this is sort of crucial to it, that you can navigate it by location. So if you're, for example, interested in any one of these locations, you could start from there, or you could start from the search bar here and enter someone that you are interested in seeing. So for example, if I want to look at Diomedes, well, I happen to know that the Diomedes I want is the Argive one, and he's the most important one, so he's going to be Argive 1. There is an Argive 2, which I think is son or grandson. And the idea is that this essentially sets out the information that we have captured so far about this figure, Diomedes. It gives you some links out to other resources, other open resources. Here it's Digital Link, Help, and Wikidata. And it starts off with some genealogical information. So this is his mother, Dipoli, and that will give you a little bit of information about her, but let's get back to good old Diomedes. He's a descendant of Oeneus. He is father of Diomedes II, right, and Amphinomus. He's husband of Argelaea and this unknown, this unnamed daughter of Daunus I was telling you about before. He has children with her, and he leads the Argos contingent at Troy. He belongs to these other contingents. For example, he's part of the suitors of Helen. The Epigonoi, these are the ones that finally actually managed to destroy the city of Thebes. He founds these cities, all in Italy. He gives his name to islands and to a plain also in Italy. He rules Argos, which is the city he was born in, and also Dalia. He creates these places, so there are some sanctuaries around in mainland Greece, and also over in this channel that he creates over in southern Italy. And he kills his kill list, I think mainly from Troy. He establishes games, he competes, he is wounded by certain people and objects. And then we've got traditions about the fact that he dies. Now you can see here the dispute, right? We've got one source that says he dies in Argos, one that says he dies in Dalmia, one that says he dies further north in Venetia. A fourth tradition that actually he doesn't die, he just disappears, right, on his island. And then we've got this idea that he's buried out on these islands. Has post-mortem existence in the underworld. He has cult sites in these places, and we also have entities that represent, for example, his breastplate. And we can see there that his breastplate was made for him by Hephaestus, and that information comes from Homer. The idea being that after we've got these connections between all these various people, places, and things, we can also see where exactly he's been mentioned. So these are all the various passages of text that he's mentioned in. This is collating them essentially into texts themselves. He's mentioned in texts that cite Lycophron and the Sabaeid and all sorts of things. He's also depicted lots of wall paintings from Pompeii, but also this is the Francois Vase and Hellenistic ceiling there. A bronze shield band from Olympia, and he's reported to be depicted on various things. For example, a wall painting in the Propylaea at Athens, reported, of course, because that painting doesn't survive, right? So we're distinguishing between direct evidence and indirect evidence here, and the people of Venetia have a tradition about him. So that gives you a kind of overview of Diomedes' traditions. If you go behind that to the data, you can actually see where this information is all coming from. So, for example, Antoninus Liberalis tells us that Diomedes is the eponym of the island of Diomedes, and Apollodorus tells us that Diomedes wounds Aphrodite, this sort of thing. So the data is the sort of the raw data that we've actually collected. The map, which sometimes takes a little while to load, will show you the places that he is associated with, and you can see that that clear association with southern Italy, but also northern Italy and Venetia there. And there's all sorts of other things that you can have a look at yourself. Any questions, actually? Should I start? And any things coming to mind that you wanted to ask about this point? All good? Should I? I'll keep going.
Thank you so much.
No. Look, it's been a very long journey to get it to this stage, it's an interesting project to work on, certainly. Okay, so one of the things that I actually found really interesting with a project like this is those of you who have done any kind of work on Greek myth, even a course at undergraduate level, will be told that Greek myth is almost impossible to define, right? That there is no way of kind of creating a definition of Greek myth which fits all of the various phenomena that we have. The problem with a digital data set is that you actually need to put in some guardrails, and you need to say, this is what we're interested in, right? And this is how we are thinking of it. And so in some ways, this is a kind of a freeing prospect, because it means that you actually just have to be quite dogmatic about something. Say, well, this fits my definition, and this doesn't, right? And so we're interested in this thing, but not in that thing. So Scott and I essentially came up with this idea, and we used two rather out of favour terms from about 100 years ago: Spartium Mythicum and Spartium Historicum, meaning the mythic period or the mythic space and the historical period or historical space. So our basic idea is that myths are any stories which essentially are thought to happen in a kind of a chronological span, which goes from the birth of the gods right through to, we decided, 5 generations after the return of the Heraclidae, which is about 7 generations after the Trojan War. Now, we chose that point because essentially that's the point at which you still have names, you still have genealogies, right? You have places like Sparta who say that, you know, they can name the tradition by which their kings, their historical kings, are part of the same genealogy as mythic kings. But what we found is that at about 5 generations after the descendants of Heracles returned to the Peloponnese, there's not really any stories, right? They're just names, essentially. And so we basically said, well, you have this mythic period chronologically. You have what's called the floating gap, which is kind of a period where there's sort of some traditions, but they're not terribly distinct. And then you have the re-emergence of writing, the birth of kind of prose writing, and the Greeks again recording essentially their own traditions. And so you get the historical period coming up. So this becomes in a way a kind of working definition of what fits into the Greek world. And so we basically say, look, we're interested in anything that happens in that mythical period, that mythical space. All of these various people, places, and objects, and the various connections that there were between them. And then we're interested in certain things that happen in the historical period. For example, any relic, any object which was said to exist in the mythic period and still exists in the historic period, we're very interested in. Epiphanies, claims that someone has an ancestor who was a god or a hero. The identification of certain places in the historical period as being those places in the mythical period, cult sites and depictions in the historical period. The problem is we can't do everything, right? And so basically we said, if these things in the, I have lost my, we can't capture everything to do with Greek myth that happens in the historical period, and so we tend to focus in terms of ancestry and depictions and cult sites and that kind of thing on heroes who are less prominent. So we're not going to capture every last depiction of Apollo, for example, standing around and doing nothing. We're just going to capture those depictions if he's actually doing something which sort of suggests a mythical story. Okay. Right. So, the basic question: why would we create digital data like this? It's an enormous amount of work, and it creates its own problems in terms of sustainability and that kind of thing. So some of the basic advantages that doing things in this way have. Firstly, we end up with a portal through which anyone can essentially explore Greek myth, and there is essentially a kind of advantage to sort of clicking around and randomly finding and discovering things, which has its own value. Secondly, and this is something that never occurred to me when I began this project, is that creating MANTO and working on MANTO has been a kind of collective exercise in close reading. I have had a kind of a mid-career retraining, essentially, in the corpus of useful texts and of all the various artifacts and inscriptions that are of use to this. Thirdly, MANTO becomes part of a kind of ecosystem, a digital ecosystem in ancient world studies, whereby our expertise can be linked to other resources in what's called linked open data, and that has a kind of value in and of itself. Thirdly, we can index all the various source materials for Greek myth, which, as I've said, go beyond kind of the traditional ones. Fourthly, or perhaps fifthly, I think I'm now up to, the very basic idea of thinking about how we would represent narrative traditions, what is most important about them, for example, how our view of them might be different from a kind of an emic viewpoint, has its own value as an exercise. And sixthly, I think, what we basically create is something which is essentially machine readable, which means that MANTO can become an analytical platform for observing mythic phenomena. And this is really what I'm going to show you over the last few minutes available to me. The idea is that basically we can analyse Greek myth from a kind of I'd like to say large data, but it's kind of middling data, apparently, according to the computer scientists. But we can look at this tradition from a kind of a more distant vantage point and perhaps see things that we wouldn't have seen if we were, for example, coming back to the same texts and thinking about them in the same ways. So essentially, data gives us the ability to do things which go beyond the limits of a single person's expertise or a single person's memory. So I want to show you just a few examples, really, of what I've been I've been working on. This first one here is an article that Rosie and I published last year, and this was basically an attempt to think about matrilineal succession. And we basically decided that matrilineal succession had four different possibilities. Matrilineal basically means where the rulership goes via a woman. So it's still two male rulers, but there is a woman somehow who is genealogically important to this transition. So top left, the old king has a daughter, and the daughter's husband becomes the new king. Top right, the old king has a daughter, and the daughter's son becomes the next king. Modality 3. The old king has a wife, he dies, and her new husband becomes the ruler. And fourthly, the old king marries, and it is her son from a previous relationship who becomes the new king. We looked for these four paradigms across our data set, and we found that there are something like 54 examples of them. Well, we were at the time, right? We hadn't collected as much data by then. And we could basically show that when people had been talking about matrilineal succession in the past, they had essentially been coming back to the same old examples of it, largely from Homer, right? And in those examples, the examples of Helen and Clytemnestra, Penelope, right, as an idea of potential matrilineal, the women are actually really, really important to that relationship. They are crucial and they are very dominant within the traditions. When we looked at all 54 examples, we actually showed the opposite, which is that the matrilineal is actually just shoring up a kind of patriarchal sense. And so, for example, in a succession by maternal grandson, well, this is a way of a city basically saying the new king is related to the old king because the grandson. However, this grandson could have a father who is, for example, a god, right? Which, of course, maybe the old king did not have. So we could show essentially that the examples that we tend to go back to of matrilineal succession are not actually terribly representative of the tradition as a whole. Okay, this other big project that I'm working on at the moment is really trying to think about mythic time. Mythic time in some ways is very difficult, and in some ways it's very easy. It's easy because in some ways it is very much like historical time, that is, it goes forward in a kind of a linear way. But of course it's not measured according to dates, it's measured largely according to generations. And so what Ginny and I have been working on is taking all of the data that is in Pausanias, right? This massive kind of account of the Greek world, and basically using that to try and find some patterns. And so Ginny was able to show that despite the fact that Pausanias's descriptions of myth are kind of completely scattered across this work, 72% of the mythic people that he talks about are actually related to each other using just data from Pausanias, right? So there is like one big family and then there are all these tiny little small families. And in fact, if you added in the genealogical relationships that Pausanias doesn't tell us about because they are so obvious that we should know, like the fact that Ariadne was the daughter of Minos, for example, something like 83% of the mythic people that are described by Pausanias are actually related to each other, to this kind of massive family web. So that's the kind of thing that you can do with data that you wouldn't necessarily, I mean, you could do with pen and paper, but you wouldn't think to do necessarily. We can then take that information and we could say, well, what are the cities that have really old traditions, really long mythic traditions over many, many generations, and which ones don't? So this is showing us these generations that are in this kind of yellow colour are the generations around the Trojan War, which are really easy to date, right? It's really obvious. If someone fought in the Trojan War or did not fight in the Trojan War. And then we basically count back, right? Father, son, to get the number of generations that each city has in Pausanias. And you notice very quickly there's some cities that have very, very long mythic traditions. So Argos and Sicyon is very close to Argos. They both have these very long generations, very long traditions that go 17 generations before the Trojan War. Most cities do not. Most cities start around about 7 generations before the Trojan War. This is showing you all of the people in Pausanias and interactions between them. Those generations in the middle are the ones around the Trojan War. So most of the people that Pausanias is talking about are actually people from around about the Trojan War generation. Essentially, I'm not expecting you can see anything there. The idea is to kind of get that weightiness around those few generations, and then it really peters out either side of it. Okay, this is another project that I work on with Ken and Kiara and Scott, and this is really again using Pausanias' data to think about like where are the hot spots of Greek myth. Now, of course, Pausanias is talking about the Greek mainland. That's the region that he discusses. So it's not strange that most of these places are actually on the Greek mainland. But you notice, for example, the glowing yellow around Troy in the top right there, and the real pinpointing of locations in the mainland. More importantly is this one here. What this is showing you is the development of Greek myth. So we're in the generations 10 before the Trojan War, and you can see it's starting to spread out from the Greek mainland. These are the places that are associated with people in these various generations, being -3, -2. That's the Trojan War there, and then it goes back down again. You see that the Ionian coast after the Trojan War gets settled, and then it peters out once more. So I'll let you settle this again. Here we go. Minus 17. It's all starting around Argos, spreads out, goes out a little bit further. Notice nothing happens on Crete, except for like a really narrow set of generations around the time of sort of Europa Minor Harriet, there it comes out. Lots of activity and it's gone. So these are the kinds of things to give us a kind of visual representation to kind of look at this material in a slightly different way. With that, I'm going to finish up. I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Oh my goodness. I guess we would move on to some questions. Does anyone have any questions?
That is incredible. And I'm wondering how, sorry, I approach this as a modern historian, not nature historian, so I'm wondering how far this potentially goes. So the first person who comes to my mind would be a mythical figure like Brutus of Troy, King of England, for example. Or in the 18th, well up until the 18th century, you've got all these fabulous posited origins of various peoples in Europe. Oh, they must be descended from this group or that group or the other group.
Yeah.
Where do you stop?
Yeah, great question. So I mean, look, you decide what your own capabilities are, essentially. On the one hand, you can say, so, you know, if I were to put limits on what we're doing, we would say we're interested in the source material being ancient. Right. So with artifacts, say up to say 600 AD, right? There's no real reason that you couldn't go later than that, except for the fact that there is a kind of a bespokeness to how you model it. So one of the things that is very difficult about working in this kind of space is that although the entities, right, the names of characters, the names of places, for example, are kind of now standardised, right? There are digital data sets for this kind of thing. The way that you connect them together is, I think, very much tied to the kind of the ontology, right? What it is you're trying to show. And so, because we built this data structure for essentially expressing and representing something that we thought was kind of characteristic of, say, a roughly ancient vision of Greek myth, and so it captures, you know, this person gave their name to that place, this person founded the city. I would say that it probably works very well with our material. Does it work as well with later material? Well, you have to leave it to an expert in that material to actually decide, like, is this the right format, like, to take over, or would you need to kind of adjust it in various ways. You also get to the problem of, and we sort of get this a little bit in kind of going between Greek and Roman material, where you'd say, well, is Ares in Greek myth the same as Mars in Roman myth, right? And as you get further and further away, you have to start saying, well, look, is Troy even the same place anymore? So are we talking about the same thing if we're putting these things together? And even with the ancient material, you start to get problems because you get this cultural diversity and even a temporal diversity, and those problems get larger as you start to go further. Yeah, really interesting.
Jumping on the back there, actually, she touched on exactly what my question was going to be. How have you handled the Roman, or particularly the later Roman? So the earlier Roman, I imagine, mixes in quite well. The later Roman very much starts to change. And then would you have to backdate for your earlier Roman to say this is separate, or is it almost like three different traditions, so to speak?
Yeah. It's tricky. I guess the workaround is that currently the material that we've largely looked at is quite conventional, kind of within it might be written in Latin, but it's very much within a kind of conventional sort of Greek mythic view. There's always difficulties with this. I mean, even within the Greek tradition, you have very iconoclastic mythographers who say some very strange things about some very conventional characters. We tend to, so long as you can kind of recognise that character that they're talking about is the one that we've got in our database. And there's a kind of enough of a shared story world to actually kind of back that up. We tend to be quite naive and just say, look, we're capturing the assertion, right? And so, we're going to have this strange tradition in here whereby this person is the son of someone very strange. And we just accept that this is part of the ancient tradition. The next thing that we're actually developing with this is a way of basically filtering the material, filtering the connections you're seeing by source material. And that would help. So you could take out all the Latin references, for example, or take out the material that is post a certain date, if that helps. In some ways we can choose our source material so we can avoid, the knownnesses and the sort of the more unusual ones. But equally, Scott and I came from from work on ancient mythography, which, it does, particularly imperial mythographers, even in Greek, they have some really iconoclastic, approaches, and that is kind of part and parcel of the tradition. So we don't want to kind of, pretend that it doesn't exist. But yeah, it's very much a question.
Do you see then maybe in the future having almost a separate database for Roman myth as a in-class section?
Within there, it's very hard to know because so much of the Roman material is basing itself on Greek models. So I'm not sure how you would disentangle those things. But yeah, it's possible. It's very possible. The Egyptian material also doesn't fit well. And so it's we would say that we're really concerned about the Greek mythic story world, and sometimes we capture other things, but we're not pretending to be comprehensive or expert.
Completely out of my depth, but I can see the powerful conceptual ideas here and how helpful this strategy is. But I did have a question about, do myths ever get lost?
Give me an example.
It was when you put up the mythical tradition of cities. Do the particular cities not have a mythical tradition because that heritage has been disrupted and doesn't leave a record for us?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have to put boundaries around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfect question. That's a really beautiful question. At this stage, myths do get lost, and they get lost because some of these stories make it into kind of the canonical tradition, right? And for us, that's kind of like, by the time that Pausanias is writing in the 2nd century AD, you have kind of a single kind of education system where people are learning, their Homer and their tragedians. The stories that make it into there, they get preserved, right? It's people like Pausanias who actually preserve, a lot of the rest of it.
Yeah.
And if his text hadn't survived, a lot of these local traditions we would not have, right?
So there could be an elegious.
Yes, exactly. And even in Pausanias, it's clear that there are a lot of ruined cities at the time, right? Cities that have been depopulated, right? And they have very, very few traditions, right? And so, their traditions have been lost because they never made it into a format which gets carried over, right? And they were never considered, they were never kind of intertwined enough into someone else's traditions to make it that far. If we didn't have the Iliad, we wouldn't know about Achilles, right? Because why would anyone preserve a story about a minor prince from Thessaly, right? So you've got to find, there's a competitiveness to this local storytelling. You want to get your stories into these kind of Pan-Hellenic, essentially, traditions. Yeah, great question.
If we have time for one more.
Yeah.
clearly from what you've been talking about, it's based on the gods and the heroes, the
Yes.
humans, so to speak.
Yeah.
What about the non-humans? Do you start involving the creatures like Medusa?
Yeah.
And if so, do you stop Medusa or can I look up griffins?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Okay. So we say that a people, mythic people, right? So anything that's got a little face, a little head, or a little double head, is anything that basically behaves like a living thing, right? So and has a name,
Yeah.
and does something distinctive in myth.
Okay.
Right. So Medusa's definitely there, right? All sorts of other monsters are also there. We don't distinguish between, like, we don't make any distinction between gods, heroes, monsters, because it's actually too hard, right? There's too much fluidity,
Yeah.
right? Some heroes become gods, some creatures are sometimes monsters and sometimes, just really bad people. And so we basically said, look, they're agents or they're collectives, right? In a kind of in our database. We also include any animals that are either important to myth or that have names. Now, this really worked against us recently when we did Ovid, and Ovid names every single one against dogs.
Yes.
But yeah, if it has a name and it's a living creature in Greek myth and it does something distinctive like Hilactian, we have to collect it, right? Do we have the griffins? I can't remember. I suspect we don't, in part because they get depicted, but I don't think they do anything. And that's like there's a real kind of there's a really marginal group of characters like I think we have the pygmies, but we don't have the cranes that fight them.
Yes.
Right, because we just don't. Right, we don't have a group of Maenads, for example, which is a kind of an edge case, for example, because other than following Dionysus, they don't really do that much. And so, you could make the same decisions in various ways, but yeah, there's lots of marginal cases. But yeah, anything living that has a name and does something distinctive in Greek myth should be in there. So long as we've done a source that has them, right? Because that's the other thing that we're just building this up as we go. So so we have to start there.
Where have you drawn the line between myth and folklore then?
Yeah, great question. Basically, chronologically, if someone can argue that it happened sometime between that event happened sometime between beginning of the world and 5 generations after the return of the Heracles. Now, there's lots and lots of cult etiologies that it's really unclear when they're sort of thinking if this is happening, right? It's just like a little story about a woman that turned into something. We tend to give those, particularly if they've got a name and they've got a bit of kind of character to them, we tend to give them the benefit of the doubt, which is scientific. But yeah, the folkloric aspect, particularly around like religion or metamorphosis traditions, they are really hard to date. We tend to give them the benefit of the doubt, particularly if they're in kind of a context, a textual context that kind of suggests that they're kind of mythic, but yeah, that's hard. Yeah, you can see as you start to think about this, like even chronology doesn't work very well. Yeah.
You had to pick some boundary.
We had the boundary, yeah,
Absolutely.
and you can kind of, you can argue back and forth, and often the decision you make doesn't actually make that much difference either, because often when we're arguing about this will be a story that appears in one source. So whether it's there or whether it's not, it makes less and less difference.
And the rules are all written down.
Yes, they are.
Good.
Yes, they are. I'm responsible for that. Yeah, but the last thing you want is a kind of an orphan data set where no one knows what the logic was. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Join me in thanking Greta for a fantastic. And just before we go, a quick note that our next seminar has been rescheduled. So Dr. Jude Conway's talk was rescheduled. It was originally scheduled for next Friday, the 3rd. It'll be rescheduled to the 10th of October from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. due to the teaching recess. Dr. Duke Conway will present on obstacle course, women's entry into skilled positions in the Newcastle steel industry from 1980 to 2000. We hope to see you there. Thank you.